Chapter 1. The Wrong Number. The 1788 O-negative was, by all accounts, an exquisite vintage. It carried the subtle, terrified tang of the French aristocracy just before the fall of the Bastille, a flavor profile Damien had found himself craving with increasing frequency. It was also, he was forced to admit as he stared at the glowing rectangle in his hand, making him maudlin. He was seated in his study, a room so ludicrously vast it had its own atmospheric pressure. Bookshelves groaned with first editions that hadn't been opened since their authors were alive. A fireplace, large enough to roast a mammoth, crackled merrily, casting flickering light on a desk carved from the mast of a ship that had sunk in the 15th century. It was all very impressive and grand and so boring. 800 years. He'd been conscious for 800 uninterrupted years. He hadn't slept, hadn't blinked in the face of a sunrise, hadn't tasted a single morsel of food since the reign of King John. He'd seen plagues and revolutions, the birth of nations, and the death of languages. He'd read every book in his library 3 times. The existential ennui was no longer a philosophical novelty. It was a roommate who never did the dishes. His thumb, pale and elegant, hovered over the screen. He meant to text Alistair, his long-suffering advisor of 5 centuries. Alistair would understand. He would offer some dry, world-weary platitude that would, at the very least, not make things worse. With a sigh that stirred dust motes untouched for a decade, Damien typed. Damien, I am consumed by a torpor that rivals the stagnant despair of ages. Is this all there is? He hit send. The message vanished into the ether. He waited. The response, when it came a moment later, was not from Alistair. Dude, it's 2 a.m. Go to bed. Damien stared at the screen. He tilted his head. His hearing, sharp enough to pick out a rabbit's heartbeat a mile away, could not help him decipher this. Dude? He mouthed the word. It felt foreign, blunt, an uncivilized pebble of a word. And go to bed? An absurd suggestion. He hadn't been to bed since the invention of the feather mattress. He should have blocked the number. It was the sensible, dignified, kingly thing to do. A wrong number was a cosmic clerical error, to be deleted and forgotten. But the sheer, unadulterated gall of the response was novel. No one had spoken to him with such casual dismissal in at least 600 years. He typed again, his curiosity a tiny, flickering candle in the vast, dark ballroom of his boredom. Damien. Like what? The reply was instantaneous. IDK. Learn to juggle? Solve world hunger? Stop whining to strangers on the internet? Literally anything else. He blinked. Whining? He had not been whining. He had been expressing a profound, centuries-old existential angst. There was a difference. A significant literary difference. The whiplash of being told to learn to juggle in response to a soul cry that would have made Byron weep was almost physically jarring. Damien. I was not whining. I was articulating a state of profound metaphysical weariness. Yeah, that's what whining is called when you use a thesaurus. Try again. Damien felt a strange sensation bubble in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't offense. It was amusement. A dry, dusty amusement, like a forgotten harpsichord playing a single, surprised note. He had conquered empires. He had stared down armies. He had personally debated philosophy with Voltaire and found him wanting. And he was currently being told to try again by someone who used you instead of you. Damien, one does not simply go to bed when the soul itself is sleepless. Okay, well, one of us has a 9 a.m. meeting, so unless your soul wants to write my PowerPoint slides on quarterly engagement metrics, I'm out. He stared at the final symbol. A tiny 2-fingered hand, a peace sign. What did it mean? A truce? A gesture of farewell? It seemed cheerful, aggressively cheerful. He summoned Alistair. The vampire appeared in the doorway so silently he might have been part of the shadow until he decided not to be. Alistair was a study in perpetual exhaustion, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had been telling his boss not to do things for half a millennium. "My lord?" Damien held up the phone. "Alistair, this symbol. What is its meaning?" Alistair leaned in, peering at the tiny icon. He adjusted his spectacles, a habit he'd picked up in the 1880s and never quite dropped, despite having perfect vision. "It appears to be a hand, my lord, making a V shape, perhaps a symbol of victory? Or, given the context, a sign of surrender?" "It feels flippant," Damien murmured, scrolling back through the conversation. "The entire exchange has been flippant. This person thinks I am whining." "A regrettable misunderstanding, I'm sure," Alistair said, in a tone that suggested it was precisely what he'd call it too, if decorum didn't forbid it. "She, I assume it's a she, the level of chaotic energy suggests it, recommended I learn to juggle." Alistair's eyebrow twitched. It was his version of a full-body spasm. "A novel suggestion, my lord." "I believe I shall continue this correspondence," Damien decided, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. "It is the first interesting thing to happen all century." Alistair's expression was one of profound resignation. "As you wish, my lord. Shall I cancel your 4 a.m. brooding session on the North Tower?" "No," Damien said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "I can multitask." 3 months later, Freya Nichols was fairly certain she was in love with a pretentious, possibly British, definitely melodramatic weirdo she'd never met. It had become the best part of her day. Every morning she'd wake up to a grammatically flawless text that read like something out of a Gothic novel. Weirdo. The dawn approaches, a relentless tyrant painting the sky in hues I am forbidden to witness. I trust your slumber was adequate. Freya. Morning. It was fine until my cat tried to sleep on my face. You good? Weirdo. The feline species possesses a charming disdain for patriarchal authority. I respect its methods. And I am not good. I am merely extant. She'd laughed so hard she'd choked on her coffee. She'd saved his contact as Mr. Darcy, but worse. He, in turn, had her saved as the emoji terrorist. Their text threads were a masterclass in cultural collision. He spoke in complete sentences, used semicolons correctly, and seemed to have a vocabulary drawn exclusively from 19th century poetry and philosophy. She communicated in a flurry of slang, abbreviations, and a veritable army of emojis that seemed to cause him genuine distress. Mr. Darcy, but worse. What, pray tell, is the intended meaning behind the cartoon skull followed by the crying laughing face? It is emotionally incoherent. Freya. It means I'm dead. Mr. Darcy, but worse. You are deceased? Freya. It's slang. It means something is so funny I have metaphorically passed away from laughter. Mr. Darcy, but worse. A disturbingly morbid manner of expressing amusement. I prefer a simple, well-articulated declaration of mirth. Freya. You're so dramatic. No one says a declaration of mirth. Just say LOL like a normal person. Mr. Darcy, but worse. I would rather be staked through the heart. Freya. See? Dramatic. She learned things about him in fragments. He was a night owl. An extreme night owl. He never once mentioned a job, but spoke of overseeing his interests with a kind of ancient authority. He seemed to have an opinion on every major historical event of the last 1,000 years, speaking about them with an unnerving, first-person familiarity. The fall of Constantinople was a tragedy of short-sighted greed, he'd texted one night. Didn't that happen in, like, the 1400s? She'd replied. A mere yesterday, was his response. She'd decided he was a history professor. A very old, very eccentric history professor who probably wore tweed jackets with elbow patches and had tenure so solid he could get away with anything. It was the only explanation that made a lick of sense. He, in turn, was utterly fascinated by her. He called her aggressively chaotic. He was mesmerized by the mundane details of her life, her commute, her terrible boss, her attempts to keep a succulent alive, right P, Steve the succulent, her passion for outrageously bad reality television. Mr. Darcy, but worse. You derive enjoyment from watching genetically blessed imbeciles attempt to find love on a tropical island for 6 weeks? Freya, it's called culture. Look it up. Also, Jason and Chloe are totally going to get back together. I can feel it. Mr. Darcy, but worse. I have witnessed the rise and fall of the Habsburg dynasty. I assure you, Jason and Chloe are of no consequence. Freya, that's what you think. You don't know them like I do. He never sent photos. Neither did she. It was an unspoken rule. The entire relationship was built on a foundation of pure, disembodied personality. She pictured him as some awkward, pale academic in his late 40s, drowning in books, maybe a bit of a recluse. A finance bro named Chad, as she'd initially feared, was out. This guy had never seen the inside of a gym. He probably thought cardio was a Roman senator. The idea of meeting him was both terrifying and exhilarating. They had danced around it for weeks. Finally, after a particularly epic late-night roast session where she'd mocked his use of the word henceforth, and he'd criticized her reliance on the acronym IYKYK, she'd thrown down the gauntlet. Freya, all right, that's it. We're doing this. Face to face. I need to see the man who says henceforth in a text message. A long pause followed. For a moment, she thought she'd scared him off. Mr. Darcy, but worse. Very well. I confess to a certain curiosity regarding the human who uses a cartoon eggplant as a valid form of communication. Name the time and place, though I must insist on a nocturnal setting. Freya. Wow, sticking to the brand. Okay, night owl. How about the Grind Coffee Shop, tomorrow, 8 p.m.? Mr. Darcy, but worse. Acceptable. I shall be the one looking as though he has seen the slow death of stars. Freya. And I'll be the one not dressed like a Victorian ghost. See ya, weirdo. Her heart was pounding. This was either going to be the most awkward encounter of her life or the start of something incredible. Or both. Probably both. Damien stood across the street from the Grind, shrouded in the shadows of a bookstore awning. The place was bright, obnoxiously so. Cheerful string lights were draped everywhere, illuminating a crowd of young people hunched over laptops, their faces bathed in the ghostly blue glow of their screens. The air smelled of burnt coffee beans and sugar, a cloying combination that made his sensitive nose twitch. He was, for the first time in centuries, nervous. What was he expecting? He'd built an image in his mind, a composite sketch of her texts, a gremlin, perhaps. A small, hyperactive creature with a phone permanently attached to its hand, communicating only in frantic clicks and indecipherable emojis. Someone whose diet consisted solely of avocado toast and existential angst, despite her mockery of his own. Alistair had been appalled by the entire venture. My lord, you are meeting a complete stranger? A human? From the internet? Have you lost your mind? She could be anyone. A vampire hunter? A journalist? A religious zealot with a steak collection? Don't be absurd, Alistair, Damien had replied, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly tailored black coat. She thinks I'm a history professor, and besides, he'd added with a wry smile, I'm bored. He checked his reflection in the darkened bookstore window, then remembered with a flicker of annoyance that he didn't have one. He'd been relying on Alistair's grim assessments of his appearance for centuries. Tonight the advisor had simply said, You look formidable, my lord. Not exactly helpful. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture born of pure habit, and wondered if it looked as effortlessly windswept as he intended. He took a deep breath, an unnecessary but calming affectation, and crossed the street. He pushed open the door to the Grind. A little bell tinkled, a sound so aggressively quaint it set his teeth on edge. The wave of warmth and noise and smell was a physical assault. He scanned the room. Laptops, scarves, beards, anxious first-daters. No sign of an emoji-wielding gremlin. And then he saw her. She was sitting at a small table in the corner, nursing a cup that was probably spewing steam and calories. She was wearing a brightly colored sweater and jeans with a hole in one knee that he was fairly certain was intentional. Her hair was a cascade of warm brown waves, and she was laughing at something on her phone. It was a full, uninhibited laugh, a sound that cut through the cafe's low hum like a bell. She was beautiful. Not just pretty, she was vibrant, alive in a way that felt like a personal affront to his entire existence. The sheer, unadulterated life force rolling off her was like standing next to a furnace. This cannot be her, he thought. This is a trick. The emoji terrorist is supposed to be a gremlin. As if on cue, she looked up, her eyes scanning the room. They were bright, intelligent, and full of humor. Her gaze passed over him, dismissed him as just another handsome, brooding man in a dark coat, and then snapped back. Recognition dawned. Her eyes widened. The laughter died on her lips, replaced by a look of profound, comical disbelief. Her jaw went slightly slack. Freya was staring. The man who had just walked in looked less like an awkward academic and more like he'd just stepped off the cover of GQ, Brooding Billionaires Monthly. He was tall, impossibly elegant, with a face that looked like it had been carved from marble by a sculptor who was having a very good day. His eyes were dark and intense, and he moved with a liquid grace that was vaguely unsettling. He was, in a word, devastating. No, her brain supplied helpfully. Absolutely not. That is not Mr. Darcy, but worse. That is a cologne model. My guy is supposed to have elbow patches and social anxiety. But he was walking towards her, purposefully. His dark eyes were locked on hers, and she could see the same dawning horror and disbelief mirrored in them. He stopped at her table, a towering shadow of impeccable tailoring. Her voice came out as a squeak. "Your torpor of ages guy?" His lips, which were frankly an unfair advantage in any context, quirked into a slow, disbelieving smile. A deep, resonant voice that she'd only ever imagined rumbled in the air between them. "You're the emoji terrorist?" Silence. She stared at him. He stared at her. The entire 3-month, text-based architecture of their relationship crumbled and reformed in the space of a single, shared, incredulous look. And then she started to laugh. It wasn't a giggle. It was a full-throated, head thrown back, tears forming in her eyes laugh of pure, unadulterated absurdity. It burst out of her, a dam of disbelief breaking. A moment later, he joined in. It wasn't the polite chuckle she would have expected. It was a genuine, deep, rumbling laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. It was the laugh of a man who hadn't properly laughed in a very, very long time. They laughed for what felt like 10 minutes straight. People were staring. Neither of them cared. The sheer, cosmic ridiculousness of the situation was too powerful. The history professor who was actually a supermodel. The phone gremlin who was actually, well, her. He finally sank into the chair opposite her, wiping an imaginary tear from the corner of his eye. "I must confess," he said, his voice still thick with amusement. "This is not what I anticipated." "You and me both," Freya gasped, trying to catch her breath. "I was picturing elbow patches, maybe a slightly musty smell. Not this." She gestured vaguely at his entire, devastating person. "And I," he countered, a playful glint in his dark eyes, "was picturing someone who lived in a basement and subsisted on instant noodles and spite. You appear to be disappointingly well-adjusted." "Give it time," she shot back, a grin spreading across her face. "The night is young." Chapter 2. The Oddities. 5 months later, Freya Nichols knew 3 things with absolute certainty. 1. She was in love with Damien, and it was the terrifying, stomach-flipping, can't-stop-smiling kind that made her want to throw her phone into the ocean and also never stop looking at it. 2. Something about him was deeply, fundamentally off. 3. She was probably going to ignore number 2 because of number 1. And that was exactly the kind of decision-making that had also led her to adopt a cat she was allergic to. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm that was equal parts fairy tale and sitcom. He took her to restaurants where the menus had no prices and the waiters appeared to have been briefed on his preferences before they arrived. He walked her home through parks and quiet streets, his hand cool and steady in hers, his conversation ranging from the absurdly philosophical to the unexpectedly tender. He kissed her goodnight at her door with a restraint that she found both charming and mildly infuriating. And he had never, not once, eaten a single thing in her presence. It had started as a quirk. Their first date at the grind, he'd ordered nothing, watching her with an amused intensity while she devoured a pastry. "I find the aromas sufficient," he'd said. She'd assumed he was one of those infuriating people who ate before dates to avoid looking messy. But it kept happening. Dinner reservations at exquisite restaurants where elaborate courses appeared before her, and nothing before him. Picnics where he unpacked beautiful food for her, arranged with architectural precision, while he sipped from a dark thermos he never offered to share. Brunches, lunches, late-night walks past food carts whose smells made her stomach growl, while he simply breathed in and declared the city aromatic. "You literally never eat," she'd said one night, 4 months in, watching him watch her eat pad thai. "Are you on some weird intermittent fasting thing? One of those guys who only eats during a 2-hour window at 3 a.m.? "My dietary requirements are somewhat unconventional," he'd replied, which was not an answer. Then there was the temperature. His hands were always cool. Not cold, not clammy, just cool. Like marble that had been left in a cellar. She'd noticed it the first time he'd held her hand, and she'd noticed it every time since. When she laid her head on his chest, it was the same. Cool. Perfectly, evenly cool. And still. Unnervingly still. No heartbeat thudding away beneath his impeccable shirts. She'd pressed her ear closer, once, and heard absolutely nothing. She'd told herself it was the fabric. Thick fabric. Expensive fabric. You couldn't hear through cashmere. That was basic science. Probably. He never suggested daytime anything, not once. Every plan, every outing, every moment of their relationship existed within the window between sunset and sunrise. When she'd suggested a Saturday morning farmer's market, he'd looked at her as though she'd proposed recreational surgery. "The morning is a hostile and unwelcoming time," he'd said. "I do not acknowledge its existence." She'd laughed. She always laughed. Because the alternative was to follow the thought to wherever it led, and wherever it led was somewhere she wasn't ready to go. He'd follow to the castle on their third date. She'd stop dead on the street, stared at the wrought iron gate, the gargoyles, the towers silhouetted against the moon, and said, "You have got to be kidding me." He'd told her it had been in his family for some time, which explained nothing and everything. She'd met Alistair, who had looked at her with the expression of a man watching the last load-bearing wall of a building he loved being removed. She'd waved and said, "Hi, love what you've done with the place. Very gothic." Alistair had not recovered. She practically lived there now. She had a suite of rooms in the East Wing. She'd brought in a normal-sized sofa, a coffee maker, and a lamp that didn't look like it belonged in a cathedral. She'd used the chalice of Antioch as a wine glass, which had nearly given Alistair a brain aneurysm. She hummed sea shanties in the hallways. She left her shoes by the front door, which was apparently a crime against 1,000 years of decorum. The castle staff, a silent legion who had served Damien for generations, were divided. Half of them were as scandalized as Alistair. The other half had started a betting pool. Marco, a hulking guard who'd been turned during the Renaissance and was built like a cathedral, was the bookie. "I've got 5 centuries of service pay that says she gets him to laugh during a formal audience," Marco muttered to another guard as they watched Freya attempt to teach Damien how to play Wordle on her phone. And through all of it, the oddities piled up. The way he moved, too fast sometimes, a blur at the edge of her vision that her brain couldn't quite track. The way he could tell her exactly what her neighbor 3 floors down was cooking for dinner. The way he flinched, barely, when she opened the curtains in her suite one morning and a sliver of dawn light caught the edge of the hallway where he'd been standing. He'd stepped back into shadow so quickly she wasn't sure she'd seen it happen. The night she'd reached across him in bed, scrolling on her phone, and accidentally elbowed him in the ribs. It was like hitting a wall. Not a soft wall. A marble wall. A wall that had been installed by someone who wanted to keep the Huns out. "What are you made of?" she'd asked, rubbing her elbow. "Granite?" "I have always been of a sturdy constitution," he'd said mildly. She'd filed it away. She filed everything away. The filing cabinet in her brain marked "Things about Damien that do not add up" had grown from a drawer to a room to an entire wing of its own. She loved him. That was the problem. She loved him with a ferocity that scared her, a bone-deep certainty that this person, this absurd, dramatic, semicolon-using, dawn-fearing person, was hers. And she was his. She felt it every time he looked at her, every time his cool fingers traced absent patterns on her wrist, every time his voice dropped to that low, private register that was only for her. Butterflies didn't begin to cover it. It was more like someone had installed a colony of hummingbirds in her chest, and they had opinions. But she also wasn't stupid. It happened on a Tuesday. They were in the library, her favorite room in the castle. She was curled up on the sofa she'd smuggled in, reading a paperback, while he sat in his ancient wing chair, reading what appeared to be a handwritten letter in a language she didn't recognize. A fire crackled in the hearth. Everything was quiet and warm and perfect in the way that only their evenings together could be. "Okay," she said, closing her book. "I need to ask you something." He looked up, his expression mild, his posture suggesting a man prepared to discuss restaurant reservations, or possibly her opinion on a new series. "You never eat," she began, counting on her fingers. "You're freezing cold all the time. You have no heartbeat that I can find, and yes, I have checked. Multiple times, while you thought I was cuddling. You never, ever go out during the day. You live in a literal castle. You have no mirrors anywhere. You once referred to the 17th century as a tedious period, but I managed. And last week, you told me the city smelled different tonight, and then described the blood types of 3 people on the next street." Damien was very still. "So my question is this," she said, her voice light, her eyes sparkling with a mischief that masked something deeper. "Are you a vampire? Or are you just the most committed method actor in human history? Because honestly, at this point, either answer works for me." She was smiling. She expected him to laugh. She expected his low, rumbling chuckle and some deflective quip about his unconventional lifestyle. She expected the bit. They were always doing a bit. He didn't laugh. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. If she hadn't spent 5 months studying every micro-expression that crossed those carved marble features, she would have missed it entirely. But she hadn't missed a thing about him in months, and what she saw now made her smile falter. His eyes, usually glinting with dry amusement or quiet warmth, went still. Not cold, not angry, just still, like a lake that had suddenly stopped moving, every ripple frozen in place. His hand, which had been resting on the arm of the chair, tightened, just barely, just enough that the leather creaked. "Damien?" she said, her voice smaller now. He set down the letter he'd been reading. He folded his hands. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was the face of a man standing at the edge of something he could not take back. "Yes," he said. "One word. Quiet. Absolute." The fire crackled. "Yes, what?" she asked, because her brain, loyal and practical, was already building exits, already filing this under, "He's playing along with the joke." "Yes," he repeated. "I am." She stared at him. He stared back. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. And then she laughed. Not her big, head thrown back, tears in her eyes laugh. A shorter, sharper thing. The laugh of a woman who has just heard the punchline and is waiting for the real one. "Okay, you're really committing to the bit. Very funny. 10 out of 10 for delivery." "It is not a bit, Freya." "Sure it's not. You're an actual vampire. Absolutely. And I'm the Queen of England." "The Queen of England is dead," he said quietly. That's my point. Both things are equally... You're doing the face again. He was. The face. The one she'd never seen before tonight. It was the face of a person who was not joking, who had never been less amused in his life, and who was watching her very carefully to see what she would do next. Stop it, she said, a nervous edge creeping into her voice. Stop looking at me like that. This is... you're... Damien, come on. Vampires aren't real. No, he agreed gently. They certainly shouldn't be. She threw a cushion at him. He caught it. Too fast. His hand was a blur, there and then holding the cushion in one smooth motion, before her brain had finished registering that she'd thrown it. She stared at the cushion. She stared at his hand. Weird reflexes, she said. You probably do CrossFit. I do not do CrossFit. Martial arts, one of those. Anyway. She stood up, gathered her book, and kissed him on the forehead. His skin was cool under her lips, as always. Very funny joke. I'm going to bed. Good night, Dracula. She walked out of the library. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her wrists. She didn't believe him for 3 weeks. It wasn't that she was stupid. It wasn't even that the evidence wasn't there. It was that the alternative to not believing was to believe. And believing meant that the man she was in love with, the man whose arms she fell asleep in, the man who left her absurdly literate good morning texts about the tyranny of dawn, was a supernatural predator who subsisted on human blood and had been doing so for 8 centuries. Believing that would require her to rearrange her entire understanding of reality, and she had a full-time job and a cat to feed. So she didn't believe. She doubled down on not believing. It became its own kind of performance. When he mentioned, casually, that he'd once attended the premiere of a Beethoven symphony, she said, "Cool, my grandpa saw the Beatles live. We all have stories." When he demonstrated, in an unguarded moment, the ability to hear her phone vibrating in her bag from 3 rooms away through stone walls, she said, "Good ears. You should audition for one of those talent shows." When she walked into the kitchen at 2 a.m. for water and found him standing in perfect stillness by the window, staring at the moon, not breathing, she said, "Meditating? Love that for you," and went back to bed. He didn't push. That was the thing that almost broke her resolve. He didn't perform tricks or issue dramatic declarations or try to convince her. He just let the truth sit in the room between them, quiet and patient, while she tap-danced around it. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her with an expression that was equal parts tenderness and exasperation, the look of someone who has told the truth and is simply waiting for it to be heard. It was Alistair who cracked the case open, not deliberately. Alistair would sooner have sawn off his own hand than deliberately reveal anything to a human. But Freya was in the hallway outside the study, heading to the kitchen, when she heard his voice through the heavy oak door. "My lord, the Prague situation is escalating. The Valdris clan has violated the Eastern Territorial boundary twice this month. They know the blood tax is due, and they are testing you. We need to respond, or every minor house from here to Budapest will take it as an invitation." She froze. Blood tax? Valdris clan? Territorial boundary? Damien's reply was low and measured. "Assemble the council for Thursday night. Full attendance. I want Marcus to present the surveillance from the Eastern Corridor, and I want the financial reports on the tribute shortfalls. If Valdris wants a conversation, we'll give him one he'll remember for the next century." "And the human?" Alistair asked. A pause. "What about her?" "She's still here, my lord. She's always here. And she still thinks this is what is the phrase she used? A really committed bit? How long do you intend to let this continue?" Another pause, longer this time. When Damien spoke, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the authority, the command. It was just him. "She will believe when she is ready. I will not force it. The truth is hers to accept in her own time. And if she never accepts it, the longest pause of all, then I will have loved her honestly, and she will have loved what she was willing to see. That is more than I have had in 800 years. Freya stood in the hallway, her hand over her mouth, her heart slamming against her ribs. The water was forgotten. The casual deflections, the jokes, the committed bit shield she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, all of it felt suddenly very thin and very fragile, and something enormous and terrifying was pressing against it from the other side. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. Chapter 3. The Truth. The next evening, she was sitting on the edge of her bed when he knocked. She'd been sitting there for an hour, doing nothing, which was so unlike her that it was itself a kind of alarm. "Come in," she said. He entered, his gaze finding her immediately. He knew something was different. He could probably smell it on her, she thought wildly. Anxiety had a scent, didn't it? He'd basically told her that once. She'd laughed it off. She'd laughed everything off. "I need you to show me," she said. No preamble, no jokes, no emojis in her voice. "I heard you and Alistair last night. I heard. Enough. And I need you to show me something that I can't explain away, something that doesn't let me pretend." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been waiting for this and dreading it in equal measure. "Are you certain?" he asked. "No. Show me anyway." He crossed the room to where a large ornate mirror hung on the wall. She'd had it brought in from another part of the castle, one of the few mirrors in the entire building, tucked away in a storage room as though someone had banished it there long ago. She'd assumed it was a decorating choice. Minimalism. Very chic. "Stand beside me," he said. She stood. She looked at the mirror. Her own reflection stared back, wide-eyed, tense, wearing an oversized jumper and mismatched socks. To her left stood Damien. She could feel him. She could feel the cool solidity of his arm next to hers, could smell the faint, clean scent of him, like cold stone and something ancient and sweet. In the mirror, she stood alone. There was nothing beside her, no shadow, no blur, no distortion, just empty space where a man should have been. The wallpaper behind them was visible through the gap, where 6 feet of impeccably dressed Vampire King was standing in reality and simply did not exist in reflection. She reached out, slowly, and touched his arm. In the mirror, her hand closed around nothing. Her fingers rested on the sleeve of a coat she could feel but could not see. The room was very quiet. "How long?" she whispered. "Since the year 1214, he said. She did the math. 812 years. The number was so large it didn't feel like a number. It felt like a landscape, a distance so vast she couldn't see the other side. She pulled her hand back from his arm. She took a step away from the mirror. She took another step. She started, stopped. "I need to go home." Something moved in his expression, a fracture, hairline thin, in the composure he'd held for the better part of a millennium. "Of course," he said. "Not forever," she said quickly, and then wished she hadn't, because she didn't know if that was true. I need to think. I need to be in my own apartment, with my own things and my cat, and I need to think." "I understand." "Do you?" "No," he admitted. "I have no idea what you are feeling right now, and I am terrified." The honesty of it nearly broke her. She could see it in his eyes, the raw, ancient fear of a being who had survived 8 centuries and was now facing the possibility that the one thing that had made those centuries worth surviving was about to walk out the door. She crossed back to him. She took his face in her hands. His skin was cool under her palms, no warmth, no blush, no pulse at his temples. She looked at him, at the dark eyes and the carved jaw, and the expression of devastating vulnerability, and she felt her heart break, and mend, and break again, in the space of a single breath. "I love you," she said. "I love you, and you're a vampire, and I need 3 days, okay? 3 days, and then I'm coming back, and we're going to talk about this like adults. Or like one adult and one 800-year-old creature of the night. Whatever." A ghost of his usual smile. 3 days. 3 days. Don't text me. Don't send Alistair to lurk outside my building. Don't do anything dramatic." "I am incapable of not being dramatic," he said. "It is constitutional." "Try," she said. She kissed him quick and firm on the mouth. Then she grabbed her coat and her bag, and she left. The 3 days were the longest of Damien's existence, and he had once sat through the entirety of the 100 Years' War. He paced, he read, he paced again. He stood on the North Tower and stared at the city and thought about every moment of the last 5 months and wondered which of them had been a last. Alistair, for once, said nothing. He simply kept the household running and left a glass of warmed O-negative on the desk at midnight, which was as close to comfort as Alistair was capable of offering. On the second night, Damien broke. He picked up his phone. He stared at the screen. He typed and deleted 7 messages, each more agonized and literary than the last. He finally settled on something short. "Mr. Darcy, but worse. I am aware that I was instructed not to text. I am choosing to interpret 'don't text me' as a suggestion rather than a decree. You should know that the castle is very quiet without your humming, and Alistair has cleaned the chalice of Antioch 4 times since you left, which I believe is his version of missing you." He put the phone down. He stared at the ceiling. His phone buzzed 40 minutes later. "Freya, tell Alistair the chalice is fine. It survived 2,000 years. It can survive me drinking Pinot out of it." Then, a minute later, "Freya, I'm okay. I just need to finish thinking." Then, "Freya, also, your timing was perfect because my cat just knocked my water glass off the nightstand and I needed someone to complain to." He smiled. It was a small, private, desperately hopeful smile, and he held onto it like a man holding a candle in a vast and endless dark. She came back on day 4, 1 day late, which she would later insist was a power move, and which they both knew was because she'd spent day 3 crying and eating ice cream and watching a documentary about bats, which hadn't helped at all. She walked into the castle at sunset, let herself in through the front gate, which she knew the code to, crossed the great hall, and found him in the library. He was sitting in his chair. He looked like he hadn't moved in 4 days, which, given the circumstances, was entirely possible. "Okay," she said, standing in the doorway. He looked up. She could see the tension in every line of him, the coiled stillness of a predator who was afraid to move in case the thing he wanted most spooked and ran. "Okay," she repeated. "Here's where I've landed." She walked in and sat on the arm of his chair, not across from him, not at a safe distance, right there, hip to hip, close enough to touch. It was deliberate. It said, "I'm here, and I'm not running." "You're a vampire," she said. "You've been alive for over 800 years. You drink blood to survive. You can't go in sunlight, you don't have a reflection, and you have the dietary habits of a very exclusive mosquito. You also overuse semicolons, you think the shrug emoji is rude, and you are, without question, the most dramatic person I have ever met, which is saying something because I went to art school." She took a breath. "I love you. I love you, and it's terrifying, and I don't understand how it works, and I don't care. I spent 3 days, fine, 4 days, trying to talk myself out of it, and I couldn't. I physically could not. My brain tried, and my heart overruled it. Unanimously. No dissenting opinions. So here I am." He was looking at her as though she had just handed him something impossibly fragile and impossibly precious, and he was not sure his hands were steady enough to hold it. "Freya," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. It was the first time she'd ever heard his voice crack. 800 years of composure, and her name was the thing that broke it. "Don't," she said, putting a finger to his lips. "If you say something beautiful right now, I'm going to cry, and I've already cried enough this week to fill your stupid chalice. Just tell me the rules. What do I need to know? What's real and what's movie nonsense?" He laughed. It was a wet, shaky, incredulous laugh. The laugh of a man who had been bracing for the worst and had instead been given the last thing he expected. He took her hand from his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm, his eyes closing briefly. The sunlight is real, he said. It is fatal, not metaphorically. Noted, no beach holidays. The invitation rule. I cannot enter a dwelling claimed by another unless invited. You have already used this against me in a parking dispute, so you are familiar. Ha! I knew it. What else? I do not age. I do not eat. I do not sleep. I am considerably stronger and faster than anything you have encountered, though I have been doing my best not to demonstrate this, with mixed results. The cushion catch. The cushion catch, he confirmed, with the dignity of a man who wished that particular moment could be erased from history. Blood? A requirement, not a choice. I have not, for what it is worth, fed from a living human in over 2 centuries. There are, shall we say, more civilized arrangements now. Medical supply networks, willing donors, vintage cellars. A pause. The 1788 was exceptional. You're a blood sommelier. I employ a blood sommelier. There is a distinction. There really isn't. She was quiet for a moment. Can you turn someone? The question landed in the room like a stone in still water. The ripples spread outward in silence. Yes, he said carefully. Okay, she said. Not now. Not for a long time. But okay. She leaned her head against his shoulder. We'll figure it out. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, and pressed his face into her hair. He inhaled. She smelled like coffee and clean laundry, and that particular sharp, sweet scent that was just her, just Freya, just the specific combination of molecules that made up the person who had, against all reason and probability, decided to love him. We'll figure it out, he repeated, and for the first time in 800 years, the words sounded like they might actually be true. Chapter 4. The Castle. Life with a vampire king, Freya discovered, was 90% absurdity and 10% moments of heart-stopping sincerity that left her reeling. Her presence in the castle was now permanent, much to Alistair's visible dismay. The ancient advisor looked at her with the pained expression of someone who has swallowed a wasp and is trying to maintain professional composure. My lord, he'd said to Damien one evening, catching him in the library. Alistair's voice was a low, conspiratorial hiss. The human used the chalice of Antioch as a wineglass. Again. Damien, who was engrossed in a text from Freya debating the merits of pineapple on pizza from the next room, looked up absently. Did she? Yes, and when I informed her, again, of its historical and religious significance, she patted it and called it a funky goblet. Alistair looked like he needed to lie down for a century. Furthermore, she has been humming, constantly, a rather vulgar sea shanty, I believe. She finds it catchy, Damien said with a shrug. This is not a fraternity house, my lord. It is the seat of the unseen empire. We have decorum. We have standards. Alistair, Damien said, his voice dangerously soft. The standards have been amended. Alistair deflated, the centuries of protocol and tradition inside him weeping silently. As you wish, my lord. One evening, she'd been annoyed at Damien for critiquing her parking. She'd left her small, unassuming sedan at a jaunty angle that blocked 3 of his priceless, black, identical sports cars. He had called it an affront to spatial reasoning. She had called him a pompous Batman. The argument had ended with her storming off to her suite and slamming the door. An hour later, he'd appeared at her door. He knocked. Go away! She yelled from inside. He reached for the handle, fully intending to stride in and continue the lecture. His fingers closed around the cool brass. He turned it, and nothing. The door wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked. It was impassable. An invisible, inviolable barrier stood in his way. He stared at the door. He was the king. This was his castle. Every stone, every plank of wood, every nail and hinge owed its allegiance to him. And then he remembered. The invitation rule. She had claimed this room. It was her dwelling now, and he had not been invited in. Freya, he said through the door, his voice tight with disbelief. Open this door. No, I'm mad at you. This is my castle. And this is my room. You said so yourself. You need an invitation, she yelled back, a triumphant note in her voice. Sucks to be you, Dracula. He stood there, flummoxed. The king of the vampires, master of the night, a being of immense power and influence, was being thwarted by a wooden door and a stubborn human. He could hear Marco, stationed at the end of the hall, trying and failing to stifle a snort of laughter. Damien shot him a look that could freeze magma. Marco immediately adopted an expression of intense, professional boredom. Damien leaned his forehead against the door. Freya, he said, his voice dangerously calm. You are testing the limits of my patience. A patience, I might add, that has been cultivated over 8 centuries. And you're testing mine. Apologize for being a parking snob. He was going to strangle something. But then he pictured her face, smug and victorious on the other side of the door, and the anger just evaporated, replaced by a wave of reluctant amusement. This was ridiculous. He was being ridiculous. Very well, he sighed, the words tasting like ash and surrender. I apologize. Your placement of your vehicle was perhaps creatively unorthodox, but not an affront. And? He grit his teeth. And I was a pompous Batman. The door swung open fully. She stood there, arms crossed, a triumphant grin on her face. See? Was that so hard? Excruciating, he deadpanned, stepping over the threshold. The invisible barrier vanished the moment he was welcome. Do not ever do that again. No promises, she chirped, pecking him on the cheek. Now, I was in the middle of a very important reality show. Are you going to stand there looking regal, or are you going to come watch Jason dump Chloe for the new girl, Brandy? He followed her into the room, shaking his head in defeat. Marco down the hall discreetly collected his winnings. Their evenings together were the kind of thing that would have made a romantic novelist weep, and a vampire purist have a breakdown. She'd curl up on the sofa she'd smuggled into the library, her legs thrown over his, reading paperbacks with cracked spines, while he worked through centuries-old correspondence. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud to him, romance novels mostly, and he'd offer increasingly appalled commentary. The hero has just removed her corset with one hand, she reported, while maintaining eye contact. Physically impossible, Damien said without looking up. Corsets have between 15 and 25 hooks. A one-handed removal would require either supernatural dexterity or a complete disregard for the structural integrity of the garment. You would know. I beg your pardon? You were alive when corsets were a thing. Did you ever? I am not answering that. You totally did. This conversation is over. She'd poke his arm, he'd catch her hand and hold it, and they'd sit in a silence that felt like the warmest, safest, most specific place in the world. These were the moments that undid her. Not the castle, not the power, not the impossible reality of what he was. These moments. His thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. The way he'd occasionally read her a passage from whatever he was reading, translating from Latin or Middle English in real time, his voice low and rich. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like she was the only source of light in a room that had been dark for a very long time. She felt it in her stomach every time. The flip. The hummingbirds. The stupid, involuntary smile that she couldn't control and didn't want to. You've really done everything, haven't you? She said one night, her voice soft. I have outlived the concept of everything, he replied, his gaze distant. There are no new stories, only new tellers. What about me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Am I a new story? He turned to look at her. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning them to liquid gold. She looked small and fragile and impossibly precious against the backdrop of his immortal, unchanging world. She was a single, brilliant firefly in a vast and eternal night. Yes, Freya, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. You are an entirely new story. The near disaster happened on a Sunday in November, and it was no one's fault, which made it worse. Damien had been spending the evening in the astrolabe chamber, a circular room at the very top of the westernmost tower. It was his favorite place in the castle, a masterpiece of medieval engineering with a retractable copper roof designed for celestial observation. He went there often, to watch the stars and to be alone with the kind of quiet that only the very top of a very old building could provide. The chamber's roof mechanism was ancient, older than Alistair, older than half the castle. It was a system of counterweights and copper gears that had been built in an era when craftsmanship meant something would last forever, and maintenance was someone else's problem. He was standing beneath the open roof, the November sky above him a field of cold, clear stars, when he heard the sound. A low, grinding groan of metal. Not the smooth articulation of gears engaging. Something else. Something wrong. A shudder ran through the mechanism, followed by a sharp mechanical crack, like a bone breaking deep inside the walls. The roof panels lurched. Not closing. Not opening. Jamming. The ancient counterweight system, weakened by centuries of thermal expansion and contraction, had finally failed. 3 of the 8 copper panels seized in place, half open, their gears locked and grinding. The remaining 5 shuddered and began to drift, slowly, unpredictably, their movement no longer controlled by the mechanism, but by gravity and inertia. Damien assessed the situation instantly. The panels were stuck. The manual override, a lever on the chamber wall, was rusted in place. He could force it, but the torque required would likely shatter the remaining gears, leaving the roof permanently open. An open roof meant sunlight. Sunlight in this chamber, at dawn, would be total and inescapable. It was currently 11 p.m. He had approximately 7 hours, more than enough time to solve this. He was not concerned. He pulled out his phone. Mr. Darcy, but worse, a minor architectural inconvenience in the West Tower. The roof mechanism has failed. I may be engaged in repairs for the remainder of the evening. Freya. Oh no, the star room? Do you need help? Mr. Darcy, but worse. Your offer is appreciated but unnecessary. This is a mechanical problem requiring strength and patience, both of which I possess in abundance. Freya. And modesty too, apparently. Okay, just be careful. He worked for 3 hours. He tried to unjam the gears manually, applying force with surgical precision. 2 panels freed. 1 immediately jammed again in a different position. The counterweight chain, weakened beyond repair, snapped entirely. Without the counterweight, the panels were dead weight, each one over 1,000 pounds of riveted copper. He could move them individually, but the moment he released one to address another, it drifted back. At 2 a.m., he reassessed. 3 panels were now open and immovable. The sky above was clear. In approximately 5 hours, the sun would rise, and this room would become a death trap. He tried the lever again. It snapped off in his hand. He texted Alistair. The advisor arrived 17 minutes later, having roused Marco and 2 other guards. They worked together, 4 vampires of considerable strength, and managed to close 1 additional panel. But the remaining 2 were fused, their tracks corroded into immobility. No amount of force, short of tearing the entire roof structure apart, would move them. And tearing the roof apart would take longer than they had. We need to leave, my lord, Alistair said, his voice tight. Now. The eastern sky is already changing. Damien looked up through the open panels. Alistair was right. The deep black of the November sky was softening, just barely, at its eastern edge. A faint, almost imperceptible gray was creeping in. Go, Damien told the others. I'll be right behind you. He wasn't. He'd noticed something the others hadn't. The door. The heavy stone door to the chamber had shifted on its hinges during their efforts, the frame slightly warped by the force they'd applied to the walls. It was still open, but the gap was narrower. Stone dust drifted from the lintel. He reached the door. He pulled. The ancient iron hinges, stressed beyond their tolerance, groaned. The door moved 3 inches and stopped. The frame had compressed, the stone settling into a new, tighter configuration. The gap was not wide enough for a person. He could hear Alistair calling from below, his voice echoing up the spiral staircase. "My lord?" Damien applied his full strength. The hinges screamed, the stone cracked. The door moved another inch, and the top hinge sheared off entirely. The door now canted at an angle, wedged more firmly than before. He was trapped. The realization settled over him with a coldness that had nothing to do with his body temperature. He was in a room with an open roof and a jammed door, and the sun was coming. "Alistair," he called, his voice controlled. "The door is compromised. I need tools, something to cut through the hinges." He heard Alistair's sharp intake of breath, then footsteps, fast, retreating down the stairs. He pulled out his phone. "Mr. Darcy, but worse. There has been a complication." Freya, who was in bed 3 miles away in her own apartment because she'd had an early meeting the next day, saw the text and felt a cold finger trace down her spine. "Freya, what kind of complication?" "Mr. Darcy, but worse. The door to the chamber is jammed. The roof panels cannot be closed. Alistair is retrieving tools." She sat up in bed. Her cat, disturbed, gave her an offended look. "Freya, Damien, the sun comes up in like 4 hours." "Mr. Darcy, but worse. Approximately 4 hours and 12 minutes, I am aware." "Freya, get out of there." "Mr. Darcy, but worse. That is the current objective, yes." "Freya, I'm coming." "Mr. Darcy, but worse. Absolutely not. Stay where you are." "Freya, I'm already putting on shoes." "Mr. Darcy, but worse. Freya, there is nothing you can do here that my people cannot." "Freya, I don't care. I'm coming." She was in a taxi 14 minutes later, her coat thrown over pajamas, her hair a disaster, her heart in her throat. The driver, noting her expression, wisely said nothing and drove fast. She arrived at the castle at 3:20 a.m. Alistair met her at the gate, his face a mask of controlled panic. For the first time since she'd known him, he did not look at her with resignation or mild horror. He looked at her with something close to gratitude. "This way," was all he said. She followed him up the spiral staircase of the West Tower, her lungs burning by the time she reached the top. She could see the door, wedged at a broken angle, a narrow gap of perhaps 8 inches between its edge and the stone frame. Through the gap, she could see the chamber. The starlight was dimmer now. The sky through the open panels was gray. "Damien," she called. "I told you not to come," his voice came back, strained but controlled. "And I told you I don't take orders." She turned to Alistair. "What's the situation?" "The hinges are 14th century iron, corroded and partially sheared. We've been trying to cut through with a diamond saw, but the angle is impossible with the door canted. We can't get leverage." "How wide is the gap?" 8 inches, perhaps 9. Freya looked at the gap. She looked down at herself. She was small. Not tiny, but small. Slim shoulders, narrow hips, the benefits of a metabolism that ran on coffee and anxiety. "I can fit through that," she said. Alistair stared at her. "Absolutely not." "Why? Is the room going to hurt me?" "It's sunlight that's the problem, right? Sunlight won't kill me. I'm human." "You could be injured. If the door shifts further while you're in the gap, you could be crushed." "Then we'd better be quick." She was already shrugging off her coat. "Damien, I'm coming through." "Freya, no." His voice was sharp with fear. "The door is unstable. If it moves while you're—" "Then hold it," she said. "You're strong enough to hold a door for 30 seconds, right?" Silence. "Right?" she pressed. "Yes," he said tightly. "Then hold the door. I'm coming through. And on the other side, I am going to figure out how to unjam those panels, or block them, or find a tarp or something, because that is what I do. I solve problems. It's the one thing I'm good at, other than emojis and annoying you." She could hear Alistair behind her, making a sound that was halfway between a protest and a prayer. "Freya," Damien said through the gap. She could see a sliver of his face, one dark eye looking at her with an expression that made her chest ache. "If something happens to you because of me, because of what I am, then it'll be my choice," she said firmly. "My stupid, stubborn, fully informed choice. Now hold the door." She felt his power gather on the other side. The door steadied, locked in place by a grip that could bend steel. She turned sideways, exhaled, and squeezed through the gap. The stone scraped her shoulder blades, her ribs compressed. For one horrible moment, she was stuck, the weight of the ancient door pressing against her chest. And then she was through, stumbling into the chamber, her feet unsteady on the cold stone floor. He was there. He caught her, his hands gripping her arms, his face a mask of terror and relief. The sky above them through the broken panels was no longer gray. It was pale. Pale with the sickly light that comes 20 minutes before dawn. 20 minutes before this room became a furnace. "Okay," she gasped, pulling away from him and looking up. "Okay, 2 panels stuck open. Which ones?" He pointed. The 2 easternmost panels, angled directly toward the rising sun. Of course they were the eastern ones. She looked around the room. The massive brass astrolabe, ancient telescopes, celestial charts framed under glass, stone walls. No curtains, no fabric, nothing to drape over an opening 20 feet above their heads. "Your coat," she said. "What?" "Your coat. It's wool, right? Heavy? Give it to me." He shrugged off his coat. She took it. It was absurdly large, like a blanket. Expensive wool, thick and dark. She looked at the astrolabe. It was tall, nearly 9 feet, a complex brass frame of rings and pointers. If she could climb it. "Boost me up," she said. "Freya, boost me up to the astrolabe. I can climb the frame and get high enough to drape the coat over the nearest panel opening. It won't seal it, but it'll block the direct light. You can stand in the shadow of the other panel's edge, the one that's only half open. That gives you maybe 4 feet of safe space. It's not great, it's not even good, but it's enough." He looked at her, this small, fierce, mortal woman in pajamas and mismatched socks, holding his coat like a weapon, devising a plan to save an immortal's life with a piece of tailoring. "You are absolutely insane," he said. "Thank you. Boost." He lifted her. She climbed the astrolabe frame, the brass cold and slick under her hands, her bare feet finding holds on the ancient rings. She climbed higher than was safe, higher than was sensible, her arms shaking with the effort. She reached the top. She could see the sky through the open panel, inches from her face. It was light. Not sunrise yet, but close. So close. She threw the coat over the panel opening. The heavy wool caught on the copper edges, draping down, blocking the rectangular gap almost entirely. Not perfectly. There were gaps at the sides, slivers where light would get through, but the direct eastern exposure was covered. "Get against the west wall," she called down, "under the closed panels. I'm coming down." She climbed down too fast, her foot slipping on the last ring. She fell. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her instantly, cradling her against his chest. "Hi," she said breathlessly, looking up at him. "Hi," he said, his voice wrecked. The first ray of the rising sun struck the coat. The wool darkened, then began to smolder at the edges where the light found gaps. A thin finger of golden light crept across the chamber floor, stopping 3 feet from where they stood pressed against the western wall. They watched it. The line of light, beautiful and lethal, inching across the stone as the sun rose. "Is that close enough to hurt you?" she whispered. "No," he said. "We're safe. The shadow holds." They stood there, wrapped together, his arms around her and her face pressed against his chest, and watched the dawn fill the room around them, while the shadow they stood in kept its ground. Alistair and Marco cut through the remaining hinge 17 minutes later. The door was hauled away. The shadow had held. Chapter 5. eternity. Afterward, in the deep, windowless keep of the castle, with the morning sun locked safely outside, and every curtain drawn and every shutter closed, they sat on the floor of his study. Not the sofa, not the chairs. The floor. Because Freya's legs had given out the moment the adrenaline left her system, and Damien had simply sat down next to her, because wherever she was, that was where he wanted to be. "I thought I was going to lose you," she said, her voice small. She was leaning against his side, her head on his shoulder, not in the abstract, not in the "you're immortal and I'm not" way, in the real way, the today way, the "you might not exist tomorrow" way. "I know," he said. "It was the worst feeling I've ever had in my life, and I've sat through a 3-hour meeting about synergy." He almost laughed. Almost. "I'm not done," she said. "I need to say this." She sat up and turned to face him. Her eyes were red. Her hair was a catastrophe. She was still in pajamas. She had never been more beautiful. "I've been thinking about the time thing. The you live forever and I don't thing. I've been thinking about it since the day you told me, and I've been pretending I haven't because it's terrifying. But tonight it stopped being theoretical. Tonight it was real, and I realized something." She took a breath. "I don't want to lose you. Not to the sun, not to time, not to anything. And I know that means eventually I'd have to become what you are, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't scare me. It terrifies me." He was very still. "But here's the thing," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "I'm not ready. Not yet. Not for a long time. I want to grow up, properly. I want to see my parents get old. I want to be there for my mom when she needs me. I want to see my niece graduate. I want to sit with my best friend on her porch when we're both 40 and drink wine and complain about our knees. I want to live my human life, Damien. All of it. The messy, short, mortal version. I want to earn every year of it." He couldn't speak. Something vast and ancient was moving in his chest, something that had been still for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "And then," she said, reaching for his hand, "when I've had enough of it, when I've loved everyone I need to love and done everything I need to do, when I'm ready, I'll come to you, and you can make me yours, forever." He looked down at her hand in his, small, warm, mortal, trembling slightly. "You are asking me to watch you age," he said, his voice rough. "To watch years take from you what they cannot take from me. To stand beside you and see the evidence of time on your face while mine remains unchanged." "Yes," she said simply. "Do you know what you're asking of me? I'm asking you to love me enough to let me be human first." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that holds an entire world in it. "I have waited 800 years, he said slowly, "for something to make the waiting mean something." He brought her hand to his lips. "I can wait a few more." She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The tears fell freely now, but she was smiling. "A few more. And then eternity." "And then eternity," he agreed. She threw her arms around him. He held her so tightly that a human man would have worried about hurting her, but he knew his strength to the fraction, and he held her exactly as hard as she needed to be held, which was very. "I love you," she whispered into his neck. "I love you, and you're ridiculous, and I am going to spend the next however many decades annoying you with emojis until the heat death of the universe." "I would expect nothing less," he murmured into her hair, "though I maintain that the shrug emoji is an abomination." She laughed. It was a watery, exhausted, completely perfect laugh. "Soulmates," she said. He smiled against her hair, the kind of smile that takes 800 years of not smiling to build. "Soulmates," he agreed. That evening, after she'd slept for 6 hours in his bed while he sat beside her and read, and did not sleep because he never slept but was content, for the first time in his existence, to simply be in a room with someone who was, they were on the sofa in the library. The fire crackled, The castle was quiet. Everything was safe. Her phone, lying on the cushion between them, buzzed. He glanced at it. A message from her, sent from 2 feet away. A single, perfect, red heart. He looked at the tiny cartoon heart on the screen, then back at her mischievous, smiling face. He chuckled, a warm, easy sound. An acceptable use of the medium, he conceded. I can't believe I fell for a guy who says medium, she teased, snuggling closer. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her impossibly close. And I, he murmured into her hair, can't believe I fell for a woman who communicates in pictograms. Soulmates, she sighed happily. And for the first time, in a very, very long time, Damien thought that maybe, just maybe, eternity wouldn't be so bad after all.